Welcome to Inside Vox, our occasional interview program. And today I'm delighted to be joined by William Binney, former NSA analyst and subsequent whistleblower. Welcome to the program, Bill.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Could we start, be very interested just to hear why you chose to resign or actually retire from the NSA in 2001 and really what made you decide to become a whistleblower?
Well, I mean, the point, what happened was they were taking programs that we had developed internally in the NSA in the SIG and Automation Research Center to be able to monitor the entire world. But they first started to focus them on the citizens inside the United States, and that started in early October 2001. So that meant they were violating the fundamental principles of the foundation of our country, the Constitution. And so I had to get out of there. Couldn't be part of it. And I knew that orders came from the White House because they wouldn't do anything like that because they would all be subject to going to jail. And also the president would be subject to impeachment, which they kept secret so that it didn't happen. And they're conditioning our population over time now to try to get us used to this mass surveillance of us. So, but the reason is fundamental. They were violating the Constitution, and I couldn't be a part of it.
This took place in 2001, is that correct?
That's correct, October 2001.
Well, because this is quite interesting. The first time I sort of became aware of this mass surveillance program, I suppose would have been, I think it was 2002 or 2003, Poindexter's Information Awareness Office. And it's interesting that you say that they were intending to surveil the entire world, because of course the logo for that was an eye looking over the entire world. Yep. And a lot of those programs that were being developed under the Information Awareness Office eventually became programs that were exposed by Edward Snowden.
No, those weren't the programs. The programs that Edward Snowden exposed were the ones that we designed. They're the ones actually doing it. And in fact, Poindexter's TIA program, Total Information Awareness Program, was pushed out there. I figured they did that simply to push Poindexter out to see how the reaction would be in Congress. In other words, they were what they were already doing in NSA, they were pushing Poindexter out there to try to make him the front guy to say it publicly. But when he got all the fire back from Congress and the public, they terminated the TIA program there, but the whole program was still running at NSA and continued even to date.
Right. So that answers one of my questions, because I was interested. At the time, I wasn't really quite able to work out why they'd made this quite such a public thing. And so you're suggesting or arguing that was purely to see what kind of response they were going to get from the public and from Congress?
If they didn't get strong resistance, they would do it out in the public. Then that could give them some authorization or justification for continuing publicly. But when it didn't happen, they had to keep it all in secret and keep very few people informed of it, and that's fundamentally what they did.
Well, subsequent to that, a couple of years later, the BBC produced a series, a short series called "The Last Enemy," which really, as its core idea, was this idea of total information awareness. Clearly, it was a fictional thing, but they were trying to do perhaps a little bit of predictive programming, maybe. But I was wondering whether in the United States you had similar media input to try and encourage people to accept this type of surveillance?
Not until much later. I mean, we had the Ashcroft visit at the hospital in 2004, which was all about this program too, by the way. And then what they did when that occurred, what happened was they informed a few more people in Congress, because they had to tell Congress what this ruckus was in the Department of Justice, So because there were a number of people ready to resign, including Ashcroft, and so they had to inform Congress, certain members of Congress, the Gang of Eight, and they had that was their way of getting around the hospital visit and the legal aspects of it. They modified that a little bit, but didn't change the fundamentals at all. So that's how they kept that going. And then after the New York Times article, they had to inform the rest of the members of the Senate and House Intelligence, And we had a member of the FISA court resign over it because here he was, this Judge Robinson, I believe his name was. He was there going along fat, dumb, and happy, thinking he was being told by the truth by the government to get warrants. When in fact, here's this whole program spying on everybody in the United States and everybody in the world going on behind his back, and he didn't know it. And he was one of the judges that was required at the FISA court to sign these warrants that the intelligence community was asking for. So he resigned, and that happened in 2006 January.
So you also retired and became a whistleblower.
Yeah.
What was the difference between the way you were seeing things going in terms of this pervasive surveillance and the work that the NSA had done up to that point?
Well, up to that point, I looked at it, I characterized it this way. Prior to October 2001, we were looking at groups of people, that is Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, those kinds of things, or militaries or governments, things that we needed to know about to make planning decisions in the U.S. government. So it was looking at groups of people planning to do things, trying to figure out what their planning was so we could issue statements of warning and intentions and capability, but after in October, they started looking individual. So that meant it shifted from looking at a focused group of people who are doing bad things or intending to do bad things, and then just looking at individuals, every individual in the world. So that was a total violation of privacy rights of individuals right from the beginning. That was clear to me right in October 2001.
And ultimately, that hasn't resulted in simply surveillance on the average man in the street, but that surveillance apparently has gone right to the White House, or well, at least to a presidential candidate.
Oh yeah, and yeah, it's gone against everybody. I mean, there's no exceptions. So if they wanted to do things, I mean, and GCHQ over there has direct access to this data too. So NSA has become the storage facility for the Five Eyes and about 8 or 9 other countries in the world who are participating in this bulk acquisition of data. And they use the IC Reach program. The Five Eyes use the IC Reach program to look into this data, do the queries that they have, and the rest of the countries and the embassies and so on around the world use XKeyscore to look into it. So those are the two main programs to interrogate the massive databases that they've created, like they're using the million-square-foot facility at Utah. There's another 600,000 square foot facility in San Antonio, and there's storage in Denver and Hawaii and at Fort Meade, of course. And then on Fort Meade, they started building a new facility there, a 2.8 million square foot facility. They took out a 36-hole golf course to do it. It's called the Eisenhower Golf Course. So I'm sure Eisenhower's rolling over in his grave because he lost his golf course,
Obviously, they're doing this bulk acquisition of data,
Yeah.
and we know they're doing it. But what isn't really known is what capability they have to process this amount of data.
Well, they don't have the capability to process it because, I mean, look at the numbers of terrorist attacks around the world that have occurred, all by people who've been known. And if they'd have been following the people who have known, they would have had a chance to prevent them. And in this case, what they've done is taking bulk acquisition and thrown it in and put it in big piles and having their analysts interrogate it with their current interrogation programs. And those are failing miserably. I mean, the problem is that even internally in NSA, from the Snowden material, there were documents of many articles, 10 of them written in NSA, some in MI5 and some in GCHQ, I think, that gave it's like we're overburdened by overload and can't see the threat coming, and things like that. And so what's happening is these intelligence agencies that are supposed to predict intentions and capabilities, that is threats, so that they can adopt, right? They're losing that capability because of the massive amounts of data that are being dumped on their people who have to perform that job.
If we could just come back to the surveillance on Donald Trump for a second, because you mentioned GCHQ there. There was an allegation at one point that actually GCHQ was involved in the surveillance on Donald Trump, because clearly there would be potentially an issue if the NSA was doing this directly. Have you any knowledge of whether that was the case?
I don't have absolute knowledge, but there is some information that's available that suggests that was true. Now, whether that's right or not or verifiable, I don't have the resources to verify it, but That has to be looked into by Attorney General Barr.
Is that something that you expect that he will do?
Yes.
Obviously, this is going on in the United States. This same kind of bulk acquisition of data is going on in the United Kingdom. In the UK, we had legislation brought in the year 2000. That was the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act. But despite that, as time went on from 2000 up to date, certainly in 2014, there were lawyers in the UK very concerned that what GCHQ was doing was in breach of RIPA. So the government then effectively brought a piece of legislation in 2016, the Investigatory Powers Act, which attempted to retrospectively legalize the law breaking that had been happening up to that point. So I was interested to know whether there had been some kind of similar effort in the United States.
I, in fact, testified to the committee, the House of Lords committee, investigating or discussing that investigative powers bill when it came up back in 2016, I think it was, as you mentioned.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
So in the U.S., they have, of course, in 2008 had to give retroactive immunity to the telecommunications company for assisting the U.S. government in doing their actually collection of data on everybody. And yet, when they did that, they never told the Congress what they were voting for, why they were giving them retroactive immunity. And it was because they were putting fiber optic taps on the lines and supported by the telecommunications company running the lines. Also, they would support them in acquisition of data. You know, they would put, like, you could think of it as putting prisms in the fiber optic lines, and the prism would split the line in two ways, and then send one route to the NSA rooms inside their own buildings of the communications telecoms companies. And NSA would capture all that data that way, and then the telecommunications company were also feeding them all the records that they had accumulated on their customers, like the billing records and things like that. So that's what they gave them retroactive immunity for, but they never told the Congress that that's what it was for. So that was the way they got around it in 2008, and then for that later on, they used the Patriot Act, Section 215, which they had their own interpretation to make that happen. And then for the justification of the bulk acquisition of data, they're using Executive Order 12333, Section 23C, that allows them to says in there, if you're after a terrorist or a dope smuggler or some international criminal, and you're looking at a communications line and you think he's on that line, you could take the whole line and everything, store it, interrogate it, find the bad guy, and you can keep it. And that's what they're doing. That's the way they're interpreting that.
Right.
And so that's how they justify it, but it's all done in secret. Now, we're challenging that. I've got affidavits in the Third Circuit Court of Appeals and also in the Ninth. The court's just under the Supreme Court, basically accusing the government of bulk collection on U.S. citizens in violation of the First, Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Amendments to the Constitution, as well as all kinds of other laws like the Pen Register Law, the Electronic Privacy Act, Electronic Security Act, all the laws, FCC regulations for communications companies too. So, and the government is slow rolling that, trying to get into it. And now I got another in, and this one has to do with Roger Stone. I've got an affidavit in his case I'm submitted to, talking about some of this stuff and how the basically lie about the Russian hack of the DNC, and we can prove that forensically, and that's why I put it in that FISA, the affidavit into that court, but that's a criminal court, and this is not civil. Other cases are in civil courts. So this one is criminal. So if we want to proceed with the criminal court, we have a chance of putting it in the record there.
Now, a word which has been appearing increasingly in British politics, in some of the policy documents and so on, is the word fusion. So I was interested in asking first, what is a fusion center?
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's their attempt to correlate data, from different sources and different inputs, and so they're trying to bring it all together and make one picture. That's what fundamentally we were doing back in the 1990s, doing that kind of thing, a fusion type thing. But we were doing it with software. Most of this effort's being done by people and people manipulating data with tools, Our point was you need to automate this and get people out of the way because they can only see and comprehend so much at a time, whereas with the software you can do the whole thing.
Over here, we're starting to hear of fusion centers being set up in the UK, but the other interesting development, I think it was in the National Security Review that was published in March 2018. The British government is now pursuing what they describe as a fusion doctrine. And the basis of this is that basically there'll be they describe it as an all-of-government approach. And that means that there's data sharing between government departments, that there's intelligence services and GCHQ involvement in that. So this has become a core tenet of the so-called national security capability. And is that something that you're seeing in the United States as well?
Yeah, that's been going on for quite some time, and it involves the FBI, DEA, IRS, DHS, a bunch of U.S. agencies are all together, and they're all of course focusing on inputs from the National Security Agency databases, which again are the common databases for the Five Eyes and the other 9 countries that are participating, 8 or 9, I think it is. So that then is the foundation of information that they're using as background, and it's stored for a long period of time. I figure it's at least 5 years at Utah, and they're probably with the new facility, they're going to have another 5 years. So I think that distributed around all their storage facilities, they probably have close to 10 years of data stored right now, 10 or more, basically, maybe even back to, certainly with the metadata, there's no problem with storing that back 2001, and there's no problem if you want to keep it for a couple hundred years, so that's not a problem. The content is the problem. That's why you keep building all these big storage facilities, and so it's according to can store as much as they have storage facilities to manage, but it back at least a decade. So all the stuff can be retroactively analyzed.
Okay, and I should probably mention that the fusion doctrine in Britain also includes connectivity with private companies and NGOs and third sector organizations as well. So it is absolutely all encompassing. Let's talk about Russiagate for a minute, because obviously there is an intelligence services and GCHQ connection with what's gone on with Russiagate, in the sense that Christopher Steele, Richard Dearlove, and people around that little grouping of so-called ex-intelligence services have been deeply involved in Russiagate.
Well, my point was, I think that President Trump is being spied on now. He was being spied on when he was a candidate. He was being spied on even before that, probably for quite a number of years, as he is a rather influential person and somebody to watch. So, they do that kind of thing, not just with they do that for all the members of Congress, the House and Senate, also for judges, federal judges, all of them, and the Supreme Court, and they watch the Joint Chiefs of Staff, as well as everybody in the White House. All this is being done in secret in NSA. And of course, CIA started their own parallel program too. So, but these kinds of things are what these agencies tend to do, is to look at and monitor people who have any authority over them anyway, So if they have authority over them, they're going to be monitored so they can see what they're planning for them, what they're planning in terms of budgetary or motions or things to manage how they operate, and what kinds of things they're planning for them to do, like covert programs or collection programs, things like that. For the Russiagate, though, thing, the whole thing was a fabrication from the beginning.
Yes.
When they said the DNC emails were hacked by the Russians, well, our group, the VIPs, Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, plus some folks over your way, we were all getting together, working on this, trying to figure out what really was the truth. And when you looked at DNC data, the actual files from late May that were published by WikiLeaks, this is put on the web by WikiLeaks. Those files had fat format properties in them, all of them. So that meant this is where the last modified time gets modified by the program reading them to a storage device like a thumb drive or a CD-ROM. So that rounds off the last modified time to the nearest even number, second. So all of those files had pretty evident. So that meant that data was read first to a thumb drive or a CD-ROM or something, and physically transported before WikiLeaks could publish it. Now that fits right in with what Julian Assange said, what Craig Murray, Ambassador Craig Murray from the UK said.
That has a major implication then for what's going on with Julian Assange at the moment.
Absolutely. It destroys everything the government is saying here.
What do they think that they are going to achieve with the latest indictments and the effort to extradite him? If he has his day in court, do they actually have much of a chance of succeeding in achieving a guilty verdict?
Here's how I think they'll run that. I originally thought that this is what they were going to do. That is, they were using the allegation that he assisted Chelsea Manning in breaking in through breaking in past through the password, the protection devices inside the area where he was. And I, initially thought, how are you going to do that remotely? My question is, can you say, get on the phone and say, okay, Chelsea, try this? Yeah, that didn't work. Okay, try this. You know what I mean? It's kind of hard for me to envision how to do that remotely. But that was the allegation. I think it was just to get him extradited from the UK so they could get him to the US, and then they would put the real charges in. That's what's been going on, and now they're starting to do that. Under the Espionage Act. It's hard for me to understand how somebody from another country can be charged with espionage against the United States. I mean, that would say that anybody in the world who does anything, that publishes anything that U.S. government's doing, is subject to U.S. law, and they're and basically treated as a U.S. citizen. I mean, I don't know how they can do that either, but that's what they're doing.
Did I see they had to go at you at one point under the Espionage Act?
Did. Yep. They tried to indict for conspiracy, basically, and of course the difference is I caught them at it, and I assembled all this evidence of malicious prosecution, and I threatened them with it. I said, okay, let's go to court, and be aware we're going to charge you with this malicious prosecution. So at that point, they dropped everything and ran away from us.
Getting back to Assange for a second, what is the outcome likely to be if he is brought to the United States?
Here's, I think, what they did to Chelsea Manning and also John Kiriakou. They brought the the evidence into court, but because it was classified, the prosecution lawyers went behind closed doors with the judge, showed them the evidence, and they convicted him in closed session. Mm-hmm. Then they came out and told the defense and the defendant what the result was. And I figured that was it. And I forget the name of how they call that. There's a legal term for it in use when you're trying to protect supposed classified material, and I have an issue with that because under Executive Order 13526, Section 1.7, that's the order that governs all classification in the United States, and that was their justification for closing the doors. And what they did was they went behind closed doors to address things like the collateral murder movie and that were being done. And that data under that executive order must be declassified because it's evidence of a crime. And what that order says fundamentally, it's on the web. Anybody can go read it. Executive Order 13526. Look at Section 1.7, and you'll see that it says you cannot classify, maintain classified, or not declassify any evidence of a crime or corruption, fraud, waste, abuse, or criminality of any kind. And that's in that executive order. So a lot of that data, including some of the data from Snowden, must be declassified according to that, because it's evidence of a crime.
That I can see how there could be some people would argue at least that there could be a conflict there if some of the. Sorry?
I say there certainly is, that's for sure.
Yes. Okay. I'm interested in your thoughts on this whole idea of giving up privacy for security, because this is the justification for everything that's going on at the moment.
I called that the first swindle of everybody. What they did was they said, like you put it, you have to, in order to have security, you have to give up privacy. Well, I mean, that was false from the beginning, and we knew that. And the thin thread program we developed internally in NSA proved that, except that it didn't cost anywhere near that the money that the bulk acquisition did.
Could you expand a little bit on the encryption thing? Because
Yeah.
if you were gathering data on individuals, you were then holding that in an encrypted form. Is that right? And if so, then what were the circumstances
Yeah.
under which that would be decrypted then?
Yeah, we basically we didn't. What we did was we encrypt the identifiers,
Right.
the IP numbers, the phone numbers, and any names or things like that, and we encrypted that so that nobody could tell who it was, what who was sending an email, but they could see what was in the email, or what they were saying on the phone. You could do a translation of it, but you couldn't see their identity, so that no one even in NSA could know who it was. Now the point then was that we could use that data to prove whether or not they were involved in an activity or not, like terrorism or dope smuggling or something like that. And if we could prove it, then we would issue a request for warrant and then unmask them, basically, and then use their identity and in the open and target them out in the open because we'd have a warrant. That was done basically on all the people who were within the zone of suspicion around a known bad by our definition of 2 degrees, no more than 2 degrees in the network or the email network or the financial network. Okay, so that was the way that we protected their identities. Even after we took the data in, we would do that. But until we got a warrant, then we wouldn't unmask their identity.
So that was the warrant was the key thing here.
Yes, yeah, because we had probable cause and justification for doing it.
And this, of course, is no longer the case.
No.
Something else that I was interested to see you commenting on recently was Stuxnet and the use of cyber attacks. And this is something, of course, which is being driven home to us that cybersecurity is probably one of the most important things that the government is doing, and that's part of the justification for mass data collection as well. But one of the discussions I saw you having, you were talking about Stuxnet as an example, and you were making the point that once one of these things goes out live, it's effectively uncontrollable after that point. And in fact, what you end up having is that perhaps some of the people that you want to be that you have an interest in have the capability to reverse engineer that and do something with it themselves.
Well, I think the wannabe virus that spread around the world a year ago or something like that was one of the examples of how they would slightly modify one of the attacks that came from either Vault 7 or the NSA leaks. But I call this cybersecurity thing the second swindle. The first swindle was of the public for money. The first swindle was you have to give up privacy for security. This swindle is you have to when these agencies know they've got hundreds of millions of lines of source code for attacks on firewalls, operating systems, switches and servers, networks, all the entire network. They have all these tens of thousands of source code lines that constitute thousands of attacks. I mean, who knows how many attacks there are? And once those were leaked, they were out there in the world. And the point was, these agencies knew these weaknesses in the system existed for over, about two and a half decades. So that when you do that, they left the weaknesses in so that they could see in and read what people were saying and doing. But they didn't fix them. Well, when you don't fix them, that means everybody's vulnerable to those kinds of weaknesses. And when other countries like China or Russia or Israel or anybody, when they find those weaknesses, they can penetrate them too. So that means that we're all vulnerable. But then when we get attacked, what do they say about? Well, we need more money for cybersecurity.
Well, maybe this is a good time to introduce the issue of Huawei then, because we are told in the UK that it's absolutely critical that Huawei is not involved in the development of and the build out of our 5G networks, and the argument seems to be that the intelligence services, GCHQ and so on, are going to be using the public 5G networks for their own communications as well as as well as tapping them effectively. So, I mean, I understand that the furore around Huawei is quite a bit more significant in the United States. It's still quite understated in this country. It's some comments about really we shouldn't be doing that. But what are your thoughts on Huawei's involvement in the build out of future telecoms?
Well, first of all, any major purchase of equipment like that, installing the communications network of any country, they have to be realizing once they do that, they have the they have the potential of bringing in tapping points for the country where they're buying the product from. For example, that's how we, in fact, implanted tens of thousands of implants around the world. One of the ways was to implant hardware and software in devices that were being purchased the countries. And so once they installed they installed our tapping device. So we had tens of thousands of them across the network. And that's certainly with the 5G, when the internet's to the Internet of Things, that opens up more and more aspects of life of everybody around the world. So that's all for the ability to tap. Now, if they have software or hardware in there to be able to do that, that's what they'd have to scan every device buying to make sure that wasn't true. Then once we'd install them, we'd be installing tapping points for the China, and then China can begin pulling in all that data from the world. But again, DCHQ and NSA would be able to monitor and see that that's happening just by the bulk acquisition of data and transfer. Even if they couldn't read it, they could still basically understand what they're doing.
But if we go back, a few decades, over the last few decades, the ubiquitous firewall product that every corporation and probably more is using is Checkpoint, and which of course is an Israeli product. So do the same considerations apply there, or is that okay because they're viewed as being an ally?
No, I would say you have to check everything. I mean, if you're going to buy something from another country, you have to make sure that it's clean. That was a standard process even at NSA. If you brought something inside NSA, even if it was a U.S. product, you still had to scan it, make sure it was clean. No implants, no software implants, no hardware implants, things like that.
So back in the day, then, when the NSA was publishing security guides for Windows operating systems and so on, were those viewed as being reliable and trustworthy, and if you followed the instructions, you were in a reasonably secure position?
That was, of course, what they said. Now, whether or not that was true, that's a different subject. Okay, so I mean, with all these backdoors and so on, and all these systems, plus some of the weaknesses in their software, I mean, I just don't think anything on the web is secure.
We're about to run out of time, but before we do that, before we sort of finish, I'd like to get your thoughts on the use of surveillance to help censor opinion on the web and on social media and so on, because clearly we were talking about the fusion doctrine earlier, but clearly the social media companies seem to be reasonably on board with this notion from governments that they need to protect, in inverted commas, protect people from fake news and so-called disinformation.
Yes, we had that problem here in the States. They're basically they're calling it shadow blocking over here, where the companies will block conservative ideas instead of liberal or progressive. They're advocates for them. That's what these companies are doing, and now they're basically shutting down certain cable programs and things of that nature and attacking them. So it's kind of, they're trying to control the narrative inside the country. So that's a way, and they're working with governments to do this, of course. And the point is that those are the things that that's a part of the process of controlling the population. I mean, you have to control the narrative, and you have to keep the information that the public sees and is aware of. You have to control that so you can directly or indirectly control what the public does. So, I mean, over here, for example, just take the Russiagate as an example. Over here, the U.S. media, the mainstream media in the U.S. was pushing that every day into the news and pushing it at the people in the country. That's why they have brought close to half of the population of the United States. They got that many people to believe that it was true. by doing that conditioning day after day and saying it over and over again from all these different news media. That's the way of conditioning people, and that's basically fundamentally what these organizations are doing when they're controlling the narrative. They're destroying free speech. They're destroying free thought. I mean, they're saying here is the way to think, and that's fundamentally what they're being what the shadow government, in the United States and around the world, and I say Theresa May was part of that, so were other leaders in other countries that have basically bought into this bulk acquisition of data, because that's the kind of thing that it allows you to do. You can discover who's not conforming to your agenda, and you can then target them and also shadow block them and things of that nature. So the way of controlling the population, your own country's population.
So what can people do about this?
Well, in the United States, I say sue the bastards, right? First of all, take them into court, get them out in the open, unfund them any way you can, call your representatives in the Congress and make sure you bitch and moan and say, if you don't stop this stuff, I'm going to vote against you in the next election, and I'm going to support your opponent, or I'm going to find, or you can start a Brexit party as you did, as in your country, right? That's the way. That's the way to start it. And if you won't get if you won't do what you want them to do, if the people vote to do something, either you do it or you're out, and then get rid of them. That's the whole thing to do. You either vote them out, or put people in who will actually do what you want done, or you unfund them, or in some way cut them off of them.
Just to finish off then, if you were to choose a couple of key targets, I assume Julian Assange is one that needs support. Yep. But yes. What is there anything else in particular that you think people should be paying attention to?
Well, I think that GDPR in the EU is something that's going to be important, especially for companies who want to do business in the EU. They're going to have to pay attention to that, and that's really getting back to protection of individuals' data and the data about them. That data belongs to the individual. Basically, that's a fundamental principle there. And so, if anybody wants to do anything with that data, they have to get the approval of that person. That's the kind of thing that needs to be pushed through. And I've been advocating over there that the way to do it is to sue the companies that are participating in these programs and transferring this data, without the approval of the individuals. So, I mean, I think the fine there for every occurrence of that is like up to 21 million euros. So I would say if some of those companies are transferring, bulk data, like on millions of people, they're going to be broke rather quickly once they get fined.
Yes. Okay. Well, look, Bill, this has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you very much for joining us today. I'd like to do this again at some point, but sure. Because I'm sure we've got a lot more we could talk about, but we're out of time for now. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me.